Hey guys, welcome to BudgetEDH. On this week's episode, we bring you Chulainn, Teller of Tales at a $100 budget. Chulainn is 2, a green, a white, and a blue for a legendary creature out of the Throne of Eldraine Brawl decks. It has Vigilance. Whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. Then you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. And you can pay 3 and tap it to return target creature you control to its owner's hand. Let's break down this Chulainn deck tech. So we do want to have a lot of ramp in this deck, so we're able to get our Chulainn down quickly, and also because we have a lot of creatures in this deck that we want to get onto the battlefield as quickly as possible. There's a ton of interaction in this deck, most of which comes from creatures. We do have a lot of creatures that have enter the battlefield effects, and those have a lot of synergy with Chulainn as we're able to bounce them with his ability, so we are going to take advantage of that. In addition to Chulainn's ability to bounce, we did include quite a few ways of bouncing our creatures either back to our hand or by flickering our creatures where they'll leave the battlefield and then come back, and then we'll be able to get their enter the battlefield ability a second or third time that way. We're going to win this game by outvaluing our opponents over the course of the game. We will play more of a control strategy with this deck, and we'll just accrue a ton of value over the course of the game with our enter the battlefield abilities that we're reusing over and over again, plus Chulainn's ability where we're drawing cards. We do have a lot of card draw in this deck as well. Let's start out this deck tech by talking about all the ways that we're able to ramp early in the game. We are going to rely more heavily on creature ramp, either creatures that tap for mana or creatures that enter the battlefield and let us search our library for mana, as it does have obvious synergies with Chulainn in being able to draw a card whenever you cast a creature. So first up, we have Llanowar Elves and Elvish Mystic. Both of them cost 1 mana and you can tap them to add a green to your mana pool. And then Avacyn's Pilgrim costs 1 green, but you can tap to add a white to your mana pool. Then we have Arbor Elf. It's a green mana and you can tap it to untap target forest. Paradise Druid is 1 and a green for a creature that has hexproof, and you can tap to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Priest of Titania is one of the better mana dorks in this deck. It's 1 and a green. You can tap it to add a green to your mana pool for each elf on the battlefield, which we do have quite a few of in this deck. Incubation Druid is 1 and a green for a creature. You can tap to add 1 mana of any type that a land you control could produce, and if it has a +1/+1 counter on it, add 3 mana of that type instead. The cool thing about this is you can pay 3 green and adapt 3. If it has no +1/+1 counters, you can add 3 +1/+1 counters onto it, making it able to tap for 3 mana in that situation. And then Fabro Elder is a new one out of Throne of Eldraine. It's 1 a green and a white for a creature with Vigilance. It gets +1/+1 for each color among permanents you control, and then you can tap it for each color among permanents you control, add 1 mana of that color. It's very much like Bloom Tender, but at a budget. Then we have Sakura Tribe Elder. It's 1 and a green for a creature that you can sacrifice to search your library for a basic land card. Put that card onto the battlefield tapped and shuffle your library. And then Wood Elves and Farhaven Elves both cost 2 and a green, and they're going to search your library for a forest or a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Next up, we have some spells that we included that enable us to ramp as well. We only went with the best ones because we do want to put our focus on creatures in this deck, but we did include the more powerful of the ramp spells in this deck. So first up, we have Cultivate. It's 2 and a green. Search your library for 2 basic land cards, reveal them, put 1 onto the battlefield tap, the other into your hand. Circuitous Route and Sky Shroud Claim both cost 3 and a green, and they let you search your library for 2 land cards and put them onto the battlefield tapped. Circuitous Route lets you get basic land cards or gate cards, and Sky Shroud Claim lets you get any forest cards. So you could get shock lands, dual lands, or any other dual land that has forest in its land type. And then last but not least, we did include Soul Ring in the deck. It's 1 colorless for an artifact. You can tap to add 2 colorless mana to your mana pool. It's still a really great card if you get it in the first few turns, and it will accelerate you very quickly. Next up, let's talk about all the ways that we're able to interact with this deck. So first up, we'll talk about all of the spells that we have in this deck, and the first ones that we're going to talk about are ones that enable us to interact with permanents that are already on the board. The first one being Beast Within. It's 2 and a green for an instant. Destroy target permanent. Its controller creates a 3/3 green beast creature token. Generous Gift is the same thing except it's 2 and a white, and it creates an elephant instead of a beast. And then Reality Shift is 1 and a blue for an instant. You can exile target creature. Its controller manifests the top card of their library. And then to manifest, you're going to flip the top card off their library face down as a 2/2 creature. If it's a creature card, it can be turned face up anytime for its mana cost. Then we have several counter spells in our interaction suite, and then the first one is Negate. It's 1 and a blue for an instant. You can counter target non-creature spell. Dovin's Veto is the same thing except it costs a white and a blue, and it can't be countered. And then we have Dispel. It's 1 blue for an instant, counter target instant spell. Next up we have Counterspell. It's blue for an instant to counter target spell. And then Narset's Reversal is blue for an instant, copy target instant or sorcery spell, then return it to its owner's hand. You may choose new targets for the copy. These are all really great ways of stopping our opponent's combos that they may have, or also forcing some of our important pieces through when our opponents try to counter them. And then the last spell interaction that we include in this deck is Nature's Claim. It's 1 green for an instant, destroy target artifact or enchantment. Its controller gains 4 life. This is just a really cheap card to interact and destroy any problematic artifact or enchantment that your opponents may play. Next up, we have several creatures that have enter the battlefield abilities that enable us to interact with our opponents. These work really well with Chulane, as Chulane can let us buy back these creatures by bouncing them back to our hands. And we do have several ways of bouncing them back outside of Chulane's ability as well. So the first card is Mystic Snake. It's 1 green, blue for a creature with flash. When it enters the battlefield, counter target spell. And then Frilled Mystic does the exact same thing, except it costs green, blue instead. Reflector Mage is 1, a white and a blue for a creature. When it enters the battlefield, return target creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand. That creature's owner can't cast spells with the same name as that creature until your next turn. Reflector Mage is a really powerful card, as you can bounce your opponent's commanders and they can't play them the next turn, which buys you some time if you need to regroup. And then we have Reclamation Sage and Acidic Slime. When they enter the battlefield, they can both destroy an artifact or enchantment, and then Acidic Slime also lets you destroy a land as well. Next up, we have Knight of Autumn. It's 1, a green and a white for a creature. When it enters the battlefield, you can choose one. Put 2/1/1 counters on Knight of Autumn, destroy target artifact or enchantment, or you gain 4 life. This is a really nice modal card that gives you some flexibility in the options that you can choose. If you need to gain some life, you have the ability to do that, or if you need to get rid of a problematic artifact or enchantment, you can do that as well. And then Caustic Caterpillar is 1 green for a creature. You can pay 1 and a green and sacrifice it, destroy target artifact or enchantment. We also included a couple of ways of resetting the board if things get out of control, and the first one is Cleansing Nova. It's 3 white for a sorcery. Choose one. Destroy all creatures or destroy all artifacts and enchantments. This is one of my favorite board wipes, as it does give you options between destroying creatures or destroying artifacts and enchantments. Then we have Time Wipe. It's 2 white blue for a sorcery. Return a creature you control to its owner's hand, then destroy all creatures. This is another one of my favorite cards, especially at a budget. It lets you return your best creature back to your hand, and then it just gets rid of everything else, leaving you with the best board position in that scenario. Next up, we'll talk about some of the creatures that we included in this deck that have Enter the Battlefield abilities on them. Creatures with Enter the Battlefield abilities work really well with this deck, as Chulainn has an ability where he can bounce those creatures back to your hand, so you can rebuy those Enter the Battlefield abilities and keep playing those creatures over the course of the game. And the first card I want to talk about is Muldrifter. It's 4 and a blue for a creature with flying. When it enters the battlefield, you can draw 2 cards, and then it does also have Evoke. You can pay 2 and a blue, and you can cast a spell for its Evoke cost. If you do, it's sacrificed when it enters the battlefield. Muldrifter is just a really great rate for drawing 2 cards in this deck, and you can rebuy it with Chulain's ability to keep drawing cards over the course of the game as you have free mana available. And then we have Elvish Visionary. It's 1 and a green for a creature. When it enters the battlefield, you can draw a card. And then Eternal Witness is 1 green for a creature. When it enters the battlefield, you may return target card from your graveyard to your hand. This gives you a really great way of buying back some cards that may have made their way into your graveyard. Then we have Cloud of Fairies. It's 1 and a blue for a creature with flying. When it enters the battlefield, untap up to 2 lands. And it has cycling 2. You can discard it to draw a card. And then Peregrine Drake is 4 and a blue for a creature. When it enters the battlefield, untap up to 5 lands. With cards like Peregrine Drake and Cloud of Fairies, they replace the mana cost that you pay. And if you have certain cards in your deck, which we'll go over in just a moment, that can double these effects, you can go infinite with this very easily with Chulainn, especially with Peregrine Drake. And then last but not least, we have a creature that also acts as a win con in our deck that has a very powerful Enter the Battlefield ability, and it's End-Raze Forerunners. It's 5 green for a creature. It has Vigilance, Trample, and Haste, and when it enters the battlefield, other creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain Vigilance and Trample until end of turn. This gives you a really nice overrun effect, and also gives all your creatures Trample, which is very powerful as it will allow you to get some damage in when you are otherwise unable to. Next up, we have 2 creatures that have the same abilities, and it's Coiling Oracle and Risen Reef. When they enter the battlefield, you can reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land card, put it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, put that card into your hand. Risen Reef is the same thing, except it also triggers off any other elemental entering the battlefield as well, making them both really powerful cards for ramping and also drawing cards. You can buy these back with Chulane's ability of bouncing them back to your hand. Then we have two cards that have synergies with landfall, and they're going to do something whenever a land enters the battlefield under control. And the first one is Rampaging Baloths. It's 4 green for a creature with trample, and it has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may create a 4/4 green beast creature token. And then Avenger of Zendikar is 5 green for a creature. When it enters the battlefield, create an 0/1 green plant creature token for each land you control. And it also has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may put a +1/+1 counter on each plant you control. These are both very powerful creatures that give you a really great enter the battlefield ability whenever you play a land. And they go really well with the next card that we're going to talk about. The next card I want to talk about in this deck has some really great synergies with enter the battlefield abilities and is by far the most powerful card in this deck, and it's Panharmonicon. It's 4 colorless for an artifact. If an artifact or creature entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Panharmonicon is going to double all of your enter the battlefield triggers, generating a ton of value for you over the course of the game. Something like Peregrine Drake with Chulainn on the battlefield can net you a ton of mana, as you'll be able to double it, return it, double it again, or with any other way of bouncing your creature back to your hand or back to the battlefield. For the next part in this deck, there are some creatures that have enter the battlefield abilities where they can return a creature you control to its owner's hand, and these have some really great synergies with Chulainn, as Chulain's going to let us draw a card and put a land onto the battlefield for every creature that we play. Also, if we have our Panharmonicon on the battlefield, we can use these creatures to bounce one of our important creatures to our hand that haven't entered the battlefield ability, return that creature back to our hand as well. So you can get some pretty crazy chains going. So first up, we have Shrieking Drake. It's 1 blue for a creature. When it enters the battlefield, return a creature you control to its owner's hand. And then Dreamstalker and Skyfisher do the exact same thing, except they can return any permanent you control to your hand. And then we have 2 creatures that do the exact same thing, except they have flash on them, which is really important because you can use them to save a creature from a removal spell, or also save one of your best creatures from a board wipe. And they're White Mane Lion and Stonecloaker. Stonecloaker also removes a card from a graveyard as well when it enters the battlefield, which is a nice little addition. And then Mana War does the same thing. When it enters the battlefield, you can return a creature to its owner's hand. The next card I include in this deck gives us a really great way of buying back all of our creatures enter the battlefield abilities all at the same time. It also gives us a way of protecting our creatures as well, and it's Eerie Interlude. It's 2 and a white for an instant. Exile any number of target creatures you control. Return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So if your opponents go to board wipe, you can blink out all of your creatures with Eerie Interlude, and then they're going to come back at the beginning of the next end step. And then you'll be able to rebuy all their enter the battlefield abilities, which is just a really powerful card. Next up, let's talk about all the ways that we're able to draw cards in this deck. Now, obviously, Chulainn is a card draw engine. Whenever you play a creature spell, you can draw a card. You can also put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. We included some creatures and enchantments that give us the same exact ability. Whenever we play a creature spell, we can draw a card, which is just going to help us accrue a lot of value over the course of the game and give us a lot of fuel to fight our opponents with all the interaction spells and stuff that we have in our hand. So first up, we have Beast Whisperer. It's 2 green for a creature. Whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. Soul the Harvest does the same thing, except it's whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield, you get to draw the card. And then Tatiova's 3 green and a blue for a legendary creature. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you can gain a life and draw a card. The 2 nice things about Soul the Harvest and Tatiova is they both work with Panharmonicon. Beast Whisperer does not. Zendikar Resurgent is an enchantment that costs 5 green, and whenever you tap a land for mana, add 1 mana to your mana pool of any type that land produced. So this essentially doubles your mana. And then whenever you cast a creature spell, you can also draw a card. Guardian Project does the same thing for 3 and a green. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it doesn't have the same name as another creature you control or a creature card in your graveyard, draw a card. Since we're playing a singleton format, Guardian Project basically says whenever a non-token creature spell enters the battlefield, battlefield, draw a card. These are all really great ways of drawing cards and accruing value over the course of the game. There aren't very many budget-friendly tutors that we can include in this deck, but there is one that was reprinted recently that has gone down in value that is a great inclusion for this deck, and it's Eladamri's Call. It's a green and a white for an instant. Search your library for a creature card, reveal that card, put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. This is going to let us get any of our powerful creatures out of our deck at a very low cost, and also it's an instant, which makes it very, very good. One of the more powerful creatures in our deck is God Eternal Oketra. It's 3 white for a legendary creature that has double strike. Whenever you cast a creature spell, create a 4/4 black zombie warrior creature token with vigilance. And then whenever it dies or is put into exile from the battlefield, you may put it into its owner's library, third from the top. God Eternal Oketra has a lot of synergies with our deck because we do have a ton of creatures in our deck. It's going to generate us a ton of tokens over the course of the game as long as it stays on the battlefield. We have 40 plus creatures in this deck, and we can bounce our creatures back to our hand with Chulane's ability to get even more tokens. And God Eternal Oketra sticks around. If your opponents kill it or it's even put into exile, it's going to come back in 3 turns or less, making it a very powerful card in this deck. The next card I want to talk about is Vizier of the Menagerie. It's 3 and a green for a creature. You may look at the top card of your library, and you can do it at any time. You may cast the top card of your library if it's a creature card, and you can spend mana as though it were mana of any type to cast creature spells. Vizier is a really great card in a creature-heavy deck, which this one is, as it will accrue you a lot of value over the course of the game, being able to cast those creature cards off the top of your library, and also being able to just look at the top card of your library at any time to see what's coming up. You can use fetch lands and stuff to get rid of your top card if you don't want it, so it does give you some valuable information over the course of the game. Another very powerful card in this deck and in Commander in general is Sun Titan. It's 4 white for a creature with vigilance. Whenever Sun Titan enters the battlefield or attack, you may return target permanent card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. This lets you buy back a lot of different creatures that you may have in your graveyard. It lets you buy back fetch lands, it lets you buy back enchantments and other things, and is a very powerful card. It's going to generate a ton of value. It's always worth including in a creature-heavy deck that has white in it, and it is very cheap, definitely a budget card. Next card I want to talk about is Vivien, Champion of the Wilds. It's 2 and a green for a legendary planeswalker. You may cast creature spells as though they had flash, and +1 until your next turn, up to 1 target creature gains vigilance and reach, and then -2, look at the top 3 cards of your library, exile 1 face down, put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. For as long as it remains exiled, you may look at that card and you may cast it if it's a creature card. This card is great because it enables you to play your creatures at instant speed. All those bounce creatures that we talked about earlier in the video all get that flash ability where they're able to save your other creatures, and all of your ETB creatures are so much more powerful if you're able to cast them at any time. You can hold your mana back for your counter spells and other stuff and play those creatures on your opponent's end steps before you go into your turn, or whenever it makes most sense to play them. You can play the game on your terms with this card on the battlefield. Also, being able to look at the top 3 cards of your library to get a creature card out of them is also very powerful. More often than not, you'll find at least 1 creature in those top 3 cards. Since we do have 40 creatures in this deck, your chances of hitting are very high. The next card I want to talk about gives us a way of reducing the cost of activated abilities in our deck, and it's Biomancer's Familiar. It's a green and a blue for a creature. Activated abilities of creatures you control cost 2 less to activate. This effect can't reduce the amount of mana and ability cost to activate to less than 1 mana. And then the second part we don't really care about, but it is tap. The next time target creature adapts this turn, it adapts as though it had no +1/+1 counters on it. Biomancer's Familiar ability will reduce Chulane's ability by 2, make it only 1 colorless mana to activate, and there are other creatures in this deck that do have activated abilities that this is going to reduce as well, giving us a lot of value over the course of the game. Last but not least, let's quickly go over the mana base that we chose for this deck. This is a mana base that's built to fit into our $100 restriction. If you have other lands, say like shock lands or dual lands, those are definitely lands that you're going to want to put into this deck if you have them. This is just a really nice starting point that you can use to upgrade later on down the road as you're building your deck, or as you get more money to put into your mana base. So first up, we have Seaside Citadel. It enters the battlefield tapped, and you can tap to add a green, a white, or a blue to our mana pool. Command Tower lets us tap for 1 mana of any color in our commander's color identity, and then Exotic Orchard taps to add 1 mana of any color that a land an opponent controls could produce. Chances are, as we're playing against 3 other opponents, your opponents will have all these colors, or at least 2 out of the 3. Then we have a couple of dual lands that have little to no downside, and the first one is Yavimaya Coast. It's a land that you can tap to add a colorless to your mana pool, or you can tap to add a green and a blue and it deals 1 damage to you. Prairie Stream and Canopy Vista are dual lands, and they enter the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. Then we have bounce lands. We have 1 of each bounce land in our deck. These are lands that enter the battlefield tapped, and when they enter the battlefield, you can return a land you control to owner's hand. These are all going to tap for 2 colored mana in our deck. The only downside is they come in tapped. And then we have the 2 cheap fetch lands in our deck, Terramorphic Expanse and Evolving Wilds. You can sacrifice them to search your library for a basic land, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and shuffle your library. And then last but not least, we have 13 forests in our deck, 5 plains, and 6 islands. There is a heavy emphasis on green, especially early in the game, as we have all of our mana dorks that have green in their cost. Thank you so much for watching this Budget Deck Tech today. If you have any suggestions for some of the picks in this deck, or agree with or disagree with some of the choices, let us know in the comments down below. If you like this video, consider subscribing to our YouTube channel if you haven't already, and check us out on Patreon over at patreon.com/BudgetEDH. There's a lot of different tiers for rewards over on Patreon. See you guys next time.